On this episode of the Heartland Author Podcast, I will be doing the very first interview of an author on this podcast. Additionally, I will have a preview of a YouTube video that I will be uploading very soon, so stick around. It's time for the latest episode of the Heartland Author Podcast. Welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp, the host of the Heartland Author Podcast. My interview guest is awaiting me, so I will now move over and interview our very first guest on the Heartland Author Podcast. I am here with Marc Cavella, who is an indie author and movie buff. Welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast, Marc.
Thank you so much for having me, Aaron. I appreciate it.
Okay, I will now get to the interview questions, which I have here on a TV screen. I've got it set up in my house as a secondary monitor.
Very cool.
The first question is, you list yourself as an indie author in your Twitter bio. As there are both advantages and disadvantages to self-publishing and traditional publishing, why did you choose the self-publishing route for your published works?
I think it was a couple different things. One is I'm unfortunately an impatient person, and I think it was going to get my work out to the public quicker if I went the indie route. Also, I did have a couple of conversations with agents. Tabernacle is my novel. That was the first novel I wrote, and that was kind of the first thing I really shopped around to agents. And they wanted me to make, the ones I spoke with wanted me to make some rather major changes to the main characters, to the storyline in order to move forward. And I wasn't really feeling that at all. And so I decided, you know what, I'd rather kind of sink or swim on my own and write what I want to write without people kind of interfering with it. And if it succeeds, that's wonderful, and if it doesn't, at least I know I wrote what I wanted to write.
Okay, you mentioned Tabernacle was your first self-published work, so without being too spoilery or giving away too much of the story, can you briefly summarize Tabernacle for anyone that may be interested in purchasing it?
Sure. Tabernacle follows Edward Jones. I describe Edward Jones as a wildly successful salesman who sells a product that none of his clients actually wants. Edward Jones is not averse to doing whatever he has to do in order to make his sales and, complete his contracts that he's assigned by his company that he works for. And in this one, he is sent to a small Latter-day Saint, Mormon community in Texas, and he meets up with a Mormon schoolmaster who is the client, and his job is to sort of, finalize the sale with the client. So he's going to do, like I said, whatever it takes to make that sale. He is going to adopt a child and present the child as his own. He's going to, um, sort of ingratiate himself to the doctor's family as best he can to try and learn more about the doctor. Basically, he's going to do whatever he has to do in order to ensure that he gets the job done.
Another one of your published works is the Ballad of Risotto. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Risotto. It's very close, though. You're
Risotto, okay.
close.
Without giving away too much of the story or being too spoilery, can you briefly summarize the Ballad of Ricky Risotto for anyone that may be interested in purchasing your work?
Sure, I'd love to. The Ballad of Ricky Risotto follows a gentleman named Waylon Pritchards, and he works for a company in 1979, Little Rock, Arkansas. It's called Ozark Championship Wrestling. This is back when professional wrestling had these sort of independent territories instead of just one conglomerated company or a few conglomerated companies. And long story short, the current champion is not going to attend Ozark Championship Wrestling's biggest show that they've ever conducted. And Waylon is sort of tasked with making sure that the champion actually shows up and loses his title to an up and coming contender. But that's sort of the overview of that story.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question that I didn't plan on asking to this previous question. In real life, who is your favorite professional wrestler?
I don't have one currently. I haven't watched as as religiously as I used to. I was a huge fan of like Shawn Michaels. I don't know if any of these names mean anything to you. Of Bret the Hitman Hart. I was a big fan of the Road Warriors. Legion of
Oh
Doom.
yeah, that's the era of professional wrestling I grew up watching as a kid before I stopped watching professional wrestling on a regular
Right,
basis about
right.
10, 12 years ago.
I think you got out at sort of the right time. It hasn't, it's very different than it was. It's to me personally, it's not as entertaining as it is, or excuse me, as it was when, like you were mentioning. Um, but different strokes for different folks.
Do you have any works in progress that you are currently writing?
Yes, I do. I have the sequel to Tabernacle, which is a novel called Place the Flowers that follows Edward Jones as he it's about 3 to 5 years later from his work with Dr. Jared Young in the first one, and it sort of follows him as he navigates. He's become a family man of sorts, and it sort of navigates his kind of life as a new family man. I also have another book in the Ozark Championship Wrestling series, which I hope will be a trilogy I'm working on currently about one of the wrestlers that's mentioned in the Ballad of Ricky Risotto. His wrestling name is Lance Sacramento. He's loosely based on Jesse the Body Ventura. And so that book is going to follow Lance Sacramento as he comes home in the early 70s from Vietnam and kind of readjust to life in America after serving a couple of tours of duty over in Vietnam.
You list yourself on your Twitter bio as a world renowned expert on films starring Patrick Swayze and Keanu Reeves. I hope I'm pronouncing the latter of those names correctly.
Correctly. Yes, you are. Yes,
I
I
have a
do.
couple of questions related
Sure.
to that uh,
Go ahead.
about Swayze and Reeves. The first one is, what is your favorite movie starred by the late Patrick Swayze?
There's so many. My God, there's so many great movies he's in. Probably Point Break.
Point Break.
Yes.
Okay. Second question I have is, what is your favorite movie starred by Keanu Reeves?
It used to be Point Break as well, because I love them together in that movie. But I'd probably say John Wick now. The first John Wick movie was really interesting and entertaining. I'm not really like an action movie guy, but I thought that was really well done.
Do you have a favorite movie that was starred by someone other than Patrick Swayze or Keanu Reeves?
I do. I have a couple. I'm a big fan of the original Rocky, starring Sylvester Stallone. I won't swear by the rest of them, although I think two is a very good movie as well. I am a huge fan of Goodfellas and a lot of Martin Scorsese's work, like Taxi Driver, Raging Bull. Goodfellas, I like The Aviator a lot as well. So those are some of my favorite other movies.
Uh, Before I move on to the next question, I will note that I have watched Rocky 4, but not any of the others.
Hmm.
And Rocky 4's pretty good. My favorite movie is Hoosiers, which is about a high school basketball team in
With Gene
Indiana.
Hackman, right? With Gene Hackman.
Yeah, Gene Hackman was the who played the head coach in that movie.
Yes,
Yes.
excellent, excellent movie. Great choice.
Uh, the next question I have is, do you outline before you write your works?
I personally don't. I know there's a lot of people when I speak to them that sort of look at that as anathema. They think that's a really bad approach, but I personally don't because what I found was when I had outlines on some other small things I felt like I got too stuck by the outline, so to speak. I would try to follow the outline exactly and not give myself room to leave the outline or create something new. So now I kind of just, have it in my head how I think a story should go. And, I have like a general framework, a skeleton. And, if something cool comes up in the meantime, for me personally, not having out an outline allows me to follow that new cool thing that just came up. So I personally don't really use them too often.
I will, before I ask the next question, I will acknowledge that I am. I found out when I was writing my first work, which was an ebook titled "Lady in the Fast Lane," that I tried writing that work without outlining first, and it did not turn out very well. So for the many books I'm currently writing now, I am outlining for my fiction works.
Right. And I think
Be-
that works really well for a lot of people, right?
yes, yeah. Some people are naturally the type that write by the seat of their pants, for a lack of a better term, and don't outline. Then there's others who pretty much need to outline in order to be able to write successfully.
Right. And I think, like I said, I got too hung up on the outline when I was writing, and like these things, these other avenues or fun little surprises would come up that, I hadn't foreseen. And I don't I like following those surprises and those avenues and seeing where they lead. And if they don't lead anywhere, that's fine. But I do like the opportunity to kind of follow them. And I felt like an outline for me personally sort of prevented me from following.
As someone who is researching computer operating systems for a book that I'm going to start writing soon, what computer do you use to write your works, and what is your favorite computer program for book writing?
I just use an HP laptop. It's Intel. That's all I know about it. It says Core i5 10th generation on here, if that means anything to you. Um, and I think I just use Word. I haven't had a lot of success with anything else. I know there's programs like Scrivener, which a lot of people swear by. There's Vellum. I don't have a Mac, but people swear by Vellum. If they say it's amazing and you can kind of just export files ready for print or ebook right away. So that's something if I had a Mac, I would really look into because people say it's really, really great. But for me, it's just writing it on Word, and then if for my current ebook with Ricky Risotto, just finding someone on Fiverr who can kind of transfer it over into a good kind of EPUB or Mobi file. That's pretty much my only writing program that I use.
I also have an HP laptop that I use to write my books, and I'm also a Microsoft Word user, although sometimes I'll use LibreOffice Writer, which is sort of an open source equivalent of Microsoft Word. And then I also will use the uh, the free version, because there's both a free version and a pro version of Papyrus Author, and I'll sometimes use the free version of Papyrus Author, which is a relatively new uh, book writing word processor slash program.
Do you like it?
Uh, I do. I've only used Papyrus Author a couple of times, and I'm just trying to get the feel of the program, and it's a pretty good program for writing books.
Do you like that better than? I didn't know the other name you said.
A
Is it
Microsoft
LibreVille? You said
Word, and the other one I said was LibreOffice Writer.
LibreOffice Writer. Okay.
Yeah, it's sort of basically an open source equivalent of Word.
Okay.
Okay, so now I can move on to the next question here. What is the best advice you have received from someone else as an author?
Honestly, it's that's a great question. I've The best advice I ever received was people have told me there's been a few times when I kind of, for whatever reason, the readers could tell I was sort of like limiting myself or restraining myself from maybe um, following the story where I really wanted to go, for lack of a better way of saying it. I wasn't sure a story should go in a certain direction, and I was like, I don't know if people are going to follow it. And then I would give it to beta readers or just friends who were like interested in reading early manuscripts or drafts, and they would say, look, this is really good, but you really have to follow these things where they want to go, for lack of a better way of saying it. Let this thing breathe. Make sure you are allowing yourself to express yourself properly. And I think that that is enough to come back to an earlier question you mentioned. um, that's one of the great things about being an indie author is that you really get to express yourself as fully and openly and honestly as you want to. And so I think that that's the best advice I ever received is just write the way you want to write, and the readers and the sales and all that stuff will happen, but the most important thing is just write the way you want to write.
This is sort of the opposite question of the previous one. What is the worst advice you've received as an author?
That's an interesting one too. I don't think I've ever gotten like really bad advice from anyone. I don't think I've ever personally gotten any really bad advice. I think the only bad advice you could get as a writer is if someone told you to stop writing, because I think some people, like for example, I know some other writers who get stuck on certain things and they just give up. And I think the worst thing you can do is give up, because then obviously you're never gonna finish your work, or you're never gonna solve your problem that you're working on in your manuscript. So I think the worst advice you could ever give to someone is to just quit or stop writing, because even if they don't want to publish or anything, if it's something they really enjoy and a way for them to express themselves, I think they really should do it.
What authors have influenced you as an author?
I think stylistically, even though I certainly don't try to emulate him, I think Ernest Hemingway is one of them, and I know he's got some views on things that are certainly not views I hold, or views that we think are acceptable anymore. In terms of his actual writing and his stylistic techniques of keeping things very minimalist and allowing the reader to experience them for themselves. His description of, for example, I'm thinking of The Sun Also Rises. He's describing the running of the bulls, and it's not really this incredibly detailed description, but it's so rich and it's so spare, but it's yet at the same time it's really rich and vivid somehow. And I think it's because you as the reader get to imagine it yourself. And I think that that's something I really kind of try to strive for, is that realism that he strove for as well, that spare realism that he had.
As someone who ha- who has a ton of non-writing influences in my writing, are there any influences outside of the realm of books or literature that have influenced you as an author?
Yeah, absolutely. Much like you, I think anything you experience can really influence you, right? As a writer, like just even if you walk down the street and you see something that catches your eye. But in terms of outside of literature or books, I'm a huge movie buff, as you mentioned. So I do, whether or not I succeed at this, I don't know, but I do try to make my books to be sort of like little movies, with like music and soundtracks and things you can hopefully really envision in your head. So, things like Martin Scorsese is a huge influence, at least in terms of like really telling certain kinds of stories, realistic stories. I am also drawn to, you know, um, those other auteur directors that did things in the 70s, like the documentaries. I was just recently watching Gimme Shelter, maybe it was Sympathy for the Devil, I think, excuse me, which was the Rolling Stones documentary, and I think it's the Maisel brothers that did that. So that sort of realism is something I really strive for too. That kind of gritty realism.
There's one final question that I have to ask you. Other than me or yourself, who do you consider to be the greatest author of all time?
It's I wouldn't put me on there. So other than you, who would I consider to be the greatest author of all time? Um, Personally, I really have been really affected by the work of Nicholas Pileggi. I don't know if you know who that is. He wrote Wise Guy. I wrote a couple of other mafia-related true crime books, and I really think that he really captures such an important part of American history, that that kind of work really affected me and how I kind of view things. So I think that that would be, to me, it's an obscure choice, but I think that that is someone who really has captured such an amazingly important part of the American experience. He made people aware of these things that they weren't really aware of. You learned about all the kind of like goings on, that you might not have been aware of, and that really have kind of still have ripple effects to this day in our country. So that's someone I've really admired as well. And you?
The greatest author of all time for me would be Mark Twain. When I was in high school, I read The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which is
Hmm.
about a mischievous child by the name of Tom Sawyer, and uh, and I've always viewed Mark Twain's works as very fascinating ever since, but I haven't gotten around to reading any more of uh, his works because I've been quite busy in life taking care of, well, just my mother now. My father, as a lot of people who are listening to this podcast may or may not be aware of, passed away a few months ago very suddenly from a sudden cardiac death. But
I'm sorry.
I've been taking care of my mother, who has been in and out of the hospital and his has been recovering very well, but I still have to take care of her quite often.
Right.
So I don't really have a ton of time to read, given helping my mother out with medical care and my work as an author. But I'd love to be able to get back to reading some of Mark Twain's works, hopefully in the very near future.
Right. I hope so too. I agree with you. He's absolutely excellent. One of the wittiest and funniest and most insightful and sharpest authors we've ever produced as a country. Absolutely.
Okay, that concludes today's interview. Thank you, Marc Cavella, for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast, and I hope to be able to invite you back on sometime in the future.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I really appreciate your time and the excellent questions, and I wish you all the best. And your mother, I wish her continued good health and recovery.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Heartland Author podcast. Welcome back to this episode. Soon, as a matter of fact, tomorrow, I will be uploading one of my bigger YouTube videos to date. Before I mention my upcoming video, I will mention that I have finished work on rebranding my YouTube channel as the Heartland Author channel. Previously, my YouTube channel lacked a branding other than my full legal name, Aaron Apollo Camp, and I felt that if I was going to use the Heartland Author branding for this podcast, it would make sense to use the same branding for my YouTube channel as well. Tomorrow, my new YouTube video will cover a topic that is particularly important to fiction writing, especially in regards to genre fiction, and that is the plot. You may have heard of the 15-beat plot structure developed by screenwriter Blake Snyder, and this plot structure is commonly referred to as the Blake Snyder beat sheet. I made a passing mention of sorts of the 15-beat plot structure in a YouTube video I uploaded a few months ago about my 3-step book outlining process. If you remember that video, the 15-beat plot structure was the basis of my short outline, which is the first of my 3 book outlining steps. In my YouTube video I'm going to upload tomorrow, I'm going to expand on what I mentioned about the 15-beat plot structure in that video and upload a new video that is predominantly about the 15-beat plot structure. I am not the first person in the writing community to have uh, gone into detail about the 15-beat plot structure, and some of the people who have done this before me include, but are not limited to, Shaylin Bishop, who has done a couple of YouTube videos on this topic, as well as writing bloggers Savannah Gilbo, Tim Stout, and Philip Williams. I hope I pronounced their names correctly. And I'm going to acknowledge these individuals in a works related section of the video I'm going to upload tomorrow. However, my video is going to be in the form of a slide presentation, and that differs from both of Shaylin's videos. And this is so y'all will be able to see and hear my descriptions of each beat and subbeat. My YouTube video about the 15-beat plot structure will be available to watch tomorrow at 12 p.m. Central Daylight Time, and I hope you watch the video. If you would like to appear as a guest on the Heartland Author Podcast, I can be reached via email or private message on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. My email addresses are campaaronapollo@gmail.com and authoraac@outlook.com. My Twitter handle is @authoraac. My Facebook page handle is @authoraac. And my Instagram handle is @campaaronapollo. Thank y'all for listening to today's episode of the Heartland Author Podcast. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding you to write your imagination. Bye for now. This podcast episode is copyrighted by the podcast host. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode in any form without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited. Sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.